Hi there. What I want to do today in this mini lecture, since you've just been reading the first part of Essay on Criticism, and that's what's at the front of your minds right now, is to actually take it from the top and go through it and look at those segments that I had pointed out in my later directions, or my earlier directions to you that were included with the overview of social, political, and literary history that I sent. Look at those passages, which is what most of you commented on in your summaries and your questions and comments, and just sort of look at them more closely, do some close readings, but also then to kind of move outward from them to address larger issues of the classic and romantic divide. In fact, I'll finally tell you why I like to call it classic and romantic rather than classic to romantic. I may break this thing in half because it's going to be pretty long. So I may do two shorter mini lectures. It'll just depend on how long my voice holds out and where I think might be a good place to put in a break. In any case, a number of you pointed out that it seems a little bit paradoxical that Pope, in Essay on Criticism, is attacking critics when he himself is being a critic attacking critics. And that's a perfectly valid observation. But let me give you the bigger picture here and what I think is really going on at the beginning of this poem. Yes, at a more, I guess you would call, detached or intellectual level, what Pope seems to be attacking are critics who are not learned enough, who have not studied the ancients, that is to say the great poets and critics of Greece and Rome, and therefore come to their role unprepared and produce really what is a bunch of schlock. He also doesn't like the animosity. He seems to be arguing for what we call constructive criticism rather than searing, angry criticism, though he himself in his satire obviously gets some good hits in on these guys. So again, another paradox. But here's the bigger picture. Throughout English literary history up to this point, it was impossible to support yourself by selling your works to the general public. Why was this? Because there weren't enough literate people in the general public to buy enough works to support you. So if you were a writer, if you were an earlier writer, if you were Chaucer, if you were Shakespeare, how did you do this? Well, the first thing you could do is have another job. You could be a courtier, you could be a statesman, you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could be a lot of different things and effectively write on the side. A perfect example of this is Pope's great friend and colleague and ally, Jonathan Swift, who is a Church of England minister. So he's got a living, it's called a salary from the church, and his writing doesn't really need to produce income. You could, though it does produce some, you could also be independently wealthy. That helps as well. But let's say you're somebody like Shakespeare. Shakespeare doesn't really have another job. I mean, we don't know what he did for the 9 years he kind of drops off the map, or his biography drops off the map. He could have been, there are theories he could have been a soldier, he could have worked in a noble household as a secretary, he could have done a lot of things we don't know. But by the time he shows up in London as a playwright, he's a full-time playwright. And so how does he make money? Well, he doesn't make money, except maybe a tiny bit, selling printed versions of his plays to the public. The way he makes money is that he is a part owner, a shareholder in the Globe Theatre. And what he is effectively doing in his plays is cranking out material that will be played at the Globe that will bring the crowds in and therefore make him money. He's a lot more like a screenwriter today, somebody in Hollywood who's got to crank out episode 6 of Angry Housewives of Kenosha, or whatever this series happens to be. It's just that he also happens to be a genius and manages to write great plays while he's doing this. Another way that you could try to make money without having to sell to the general public is through patronage. If you were a courtier, or even if you were someone like Shakespeare, you could write poems and so forth, usually poems, epic poems, pastoral poems, all kinds of poems, and dedicate them to an aristocrat. Shakespeare does this as well. He writes 2 long poems that aren't usually that much read compared to his plays and his sonnets, and he dedicates one of them to the Earl of Southampton, in hopes that the Earl of Southampton will either give him money, will give him some kind of a position. Patronage could be manifest in all sorts of different ways. The main point here is this: up until the early 18th century, except again, as I say, in the theater or through patronage, it was pretty much impossible to support yourself as a writer. But, as I said in the historical overview, things were changing because of the Puritan dominance after the English Civil War. Literacy rates were on the rise. A larger and larger middle class of people were able to read and wanted to read and wanted to read the kinds of things that most people want to read today. That is to say, they wanted to read slashing attacks on other people. They wanted to read scandal. They wanted to read romance. They wanted to read what were called novels, which were looked down upon very much. They wanted to read the National Enquirer. Or if you want to translate it to TV, they wanted to watch screaming, talking heads yelling at each other rather than reasoned debate about particular issues. And one of the ways you could do this, especially if you were not talented enough, at least according to Pope, to be a writer, is to become a critic, a slashing, controversial critic, and then attack people in print, and if you were lucky, even create what's called a paper war, where they attack you back, and all of these publications make money. And so you finally have a reading audience that can somewhat support writers. And from Pope's point of view, therefore, all sorts of people who shouldn't be writing at all have jumped into the game and started to write. And a lot of them as critics who were combative and liked to push the envelope, and even sometimes would, this actually happened, would make up paper wars against themselves. They would write a slashing criticism of whatever it might be. It could be literary, it could be political, whatever, under an assumed name, and then they would answer themselves under another assumed name and essentially stage a fake paper war, as they were called, against themselves to sell things. So this is the larger overarching background in terms of what I guess you could call the literary industry or the commercialization of literature. That is, I think, the bedrock of what Pope is doing here. Yes, he does want critics, ideally, to engage in constructive, intelligent, informed, reason-based criticism, like the ancients, that is to say, the great writers of Greece and Rome. But he also has an ulterior motive. He wants to weed out, seemingly, these uninformed, purely commercially based writers, like the people who write for National Enquirer. I mean, who comes up with titles like Obama meets space aliens in Gobi Desert? I mean, really, do they believe that? No. They're trying to sell it to some audience that either believes it or thinks it's a good joke. And that's really what a lot of the criticism is like at this time. However, one more caveat about Pope. So Pope wants to seem to stand above it, but the fact of the matter is that if you look back through literary history, Pope himself is probably the first author in English literary history who actually managed to totally support himself by selling his work to the public. And I'll talk more about that later because I've taken too long giving you this background already. But basically, he's got money in the game here as well. Again, I will elaborate with that next time because I want to get to the poem. In any case, so he is attacking these critics from from two levels at once. One, the intellectual, moral, ethical level, and one from, I think, the commercial level. Okay, onward we go. I want to move again through just the major points. So now you have the background in terms of literary history. And of course, Pope's solution seemingly is that what you need to do to help you out as a critic is to limit yourself, to figure out how much you know and only focus on that. This is from about lines 46 down. He will utterly contradict this later in the poem, as he will contradict many things later in the poem. The first passage I want to look at closely is the passage on nature, with a big capital N. In fact, in the text you're reading, it's all capitalized. And my question to you was, what does he mean by nature? Well, basically almost everything. In class, if we had a regular class, I would have your answers, we would go back and forth, but I'm just going to give it to you here. First of all, and I guess you would call the most mundane level, nature can mean rocks and trees, what we call nature today. However, at a human level, it can mean human nature, the way humans generally behave. The tougher part, and the part that he really emphasizes in the passage, the very famous passage on nature that begins in this text on line 68. Quick aside here. Pope revised this poem throughout his life. So there are little spots in this poem where the lines will be changed depending on certain lines, not many, will be changed depending on the edition and the year of the poem you're reading. So I just want to tell you that in case you end up reading this in another class and you're going, wait, that wasn't in that one that I read in Bertelson's class. In any case, look at the opening lines on nature. First, follow nature and your judgment frame by her just standard, which is still the same. Still here means always. So nature is a just standard that is always the same. Unerring nature. Nature can never make a mistake. Still divinely bright. Divinely bright? Does that mean infused by God? Is nature being equated with God? One clear, unchanged, never changes, and universal light. Life, force, and beauty must to all impart at once the source and end and test of art. Yikes! Nature sounds like the force. I mean, what is it that nature can't do? It doesn't just sound like rocks and trees or going to Yosemite. So how do you reconcile all this? All right, I'm just going to give it to you quick. Again, if we were in a classroom, I'd draw it on the board, make it easier to understand. But I'm just going to give it to you right now the best I can in a lecture mode. All right. There was a time in human history, if you are a believing Christian, which most people at this time in England were, even though they were in various different denominations and so forth, when the world was, when nature, from human nature all the way down to rocks and trees and all the way up to heaven, was perfect. When was that? Oh, you're all going, the Garden of Eden. And you're absolutely correct. That was God's perfect template for the world. Everything was perfect. People were perfect. The cows were perfect. The ants were perfect. I guess there was one snake that wasn't perfect, but that's just because Satan got into his head. It was perfect, right? And then what happened? The fall. And after the fall, nature, which I guess you could call the second kind of nature maybe lowercase n nature, and the big kind of nature, the unfallen nature, uppercase, capital nature. I'm just calling it that. That's not how critics usually talk about it. And nature becomes degenerate. Things start to die. Things start to rot. People start to murder each other like Cain and Abel. Famine, thunderstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes, all that bad stuff. Okay? So that's the nature we live in. So, when Pope talks about nature, that is to say, the capital N style nature in his works, and again, it changes, depends what he's talking about. Sometimes he is only talking rocks and trees when he uses nature in a lesser way, but in this particular passage, he is talking about that underlying template, that perfect template that still exists, as it were, beneath the fallen, degenerate world. He's talking about the possibility of perfect human behavior. He's talking about the possibility of a perfectly beautiful landscape, a perfectly beautiful man, a perfectly beautiful woman, a perfectly ethical system, a perfectly whatever it might be. And the artist's role for Pope, and the thing that aids the artist, is that artist's ability, by looking at fallen nature, to extract from it a more perfect or a more general, the form, I guess you could call it, nature. Now, what is interesting about this is that in ancient philosophy and thought, particularly in the thought of Plato, there's an analogy to this. The analogy that Plato comes up with is the archetype. I don't know if you guys know about this, I'm sure some of you do. He says that material life, that's not reality, because it's all going to rot away. I mean, this lectern's rotting away already. Certainly in 10 years, this is going to be gone, right? So he hypothesizes that somewhere, in the celestial attic, the archetypal attic, we don't know where, there are in fact perfect forms of everything. The idea of that thing, that's what he calls an archetype. And those forms on Earth are filled with matter, with atoms, with material, and become manifest as material forms. But they are not reality, because they are going to disappear. The true reality are the perfect templates of a lectern, I guess, or of a human being, that are in this archetypal attic. So if you combine that with the story of Eden and then the fall of a perfect, and what would have been everlasting perfect earth into degeneration, you come up with one of the most interesting concepts of the Renaissance, which is called Christian Neoplatonism, where they combine the idea of Plato, which clearly takes place outside of Christianity, and the idea of the fall, and see that it's effectively parallel. Okay, now that I have you totally confused, let me say this. The reason this is of interest to artists and writers is this. It is still possible for us, and it's not really even that hard, to conceive of perfection, to visualize perfection in our imaginations. And then if we record those imaginations, those images, in writing and painting and sculpture and so forth, and I will be sending you examples of this later, you, in effect, through art, have reattained nature, the good kind. You have caught a glimpse of it, and if you're a great artist, you have preserved it for others. So this is kind of what Pope is thinking. He's looking back at the ancients, and he's taking these ideas, combining them with Christianity, and moving them up to the present. Now, since I'm on a big aside here, let me just give you a little bit more background of the whole difficulty of combining Christianity with a veneration of the ancients. Again, you all know what happens with the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning, blah, 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 that you've been taught in high school, I'm sure, and so forth. Hang on, I need some water. But I don't think they probably tell you the big problem with this. The problem is this. If you are an Orthodox Christian, where do you have to believe all those people that you admire, like Plato and Aristotle and Thucydides and Aeschylus and Virgil and Homer and, you know, the entire gigantic pantheon of great writers from Greece and Rome and philosophers and scientists and you name it? Where do you have to think they are right now? Oh, burning in the eternal fires of hell. That's right. They're pagans. They're burning in the eternal fires of hell. Except you admire them and want to use them in your work. This is a problem. And it's not one that's very easily gotten around. Now, Dante in the Inferno comes up with a great solution. He's got the various levels of hell, right? Really bad stuff at the bottom. But at the very top, it's not really that bad. It's kind of like Austin in the summer. And that's where he puts all the people he admires from Greece and Rome. Well, maybe that's one way to do it. In any case, I'm just saying this whole idea of combining Christianity with a veneration of the ancients is tough. But by the 18th century, everybody is basically doing it, and that's what Pope is doing in this poem. So what you're seeing in this poem then is a restatement of many things that had been said in ancient criticism and in ancient poetry. Probably the biggest influence on this poem is a Latin work by Horace called Ars Poetica, which just translates to the art of poetry. And Horace is a Roman poet and writer. And Pope leans very heavily on that. But he's also taking a lot of stuff that was written during the Renaissance by neoclassical writers, that is to say, neoclassical meaning the new classicism, the revival of the classics, and just trying to put it together in a form that is accessible, not necessarily new in terms of ideas, maybe new in presentation so that it is more accessible to his readership. Because for people who adhere to what in this course we're going to call classic ideology, the greatest writing had already been done by the ancients, by the Greeks and the Romans, and it was never going to be surpassed. It could only be imitated, made more accessible to a particular period, maybe varied a little bit here and there, but their real sense was that the moderns, as they called them, were just never going to be able to live up to the ancients. And there was a big background controversy, much larger than just literary. It had to do with science, had to do with everything, called the ancients versus moderns controversy during this period. The ancients you could call classic. Moderns you could almost call romantic. Okay? Again, we'll get back to this in another way later on, but as long as I'm here, I wanted to give you that background. Okay, so let's see what he does with nature here. Obviously nature, if you can get that glimpse of the universal, of the perfection and so forth, of those things that are common to all human beings rather than small idiosyncrasies. And classicism and the idea of nature that Pope is promoting does promote the universal, where people would ask, how am I the same? Not, how am I different and unique? That's totally romantic. How am I different and unique? No. How am I the same? How do I fit? Because what they thought was that the thing that made literature last was the degree to which the characters and the actions transcended time. What do we care about what a bunch of Greeks and Trojans are doing on a field outside of Troy on the coast of Turkey in, 10,000 or 10,000 BC, or no, not 10,000, 1,000 BC. I mean, what do we care? And what do we know? Well, the details, we don't know a lot about it. We've never seen hand-to-hand combat on the plains of Troy. But in terms of the human feelings, in terms of the way emotionally the characters respond to things, Homer also hits universals, the way people will in fact act in all times and in all places. In other words, neoclassicists tend to believe in nature, not nurture, as the primary driver and important point of human behavior and of literature and art. Now, a modern sociologist is going to dispute this and say, well, it's more nurture than nature. But that's just another topic. Sorry, my voice is breaking down here, so I may stop in a minute and then come back. But let me try water one more time, and then we'll see what happens. Okay, let's at least finish this nature passage and maybe go a little further. Below that, he says that art, which is the human mode of presenting nature, should in fact be minimized in poetry and in painting. You shouldn't be showing off your style. You shouldn't be an impressionist who wants everybody to go, ooh, look how he clopped all that paint together to make that happen. What you are basically after is conveying the idea, elaborating it through metaphor and so forth, but metaphors that are understandable, that people will immediately see the relevance of. Not wacky metaphors like metaphysical poetry uses. So, he goes on. And now he gets to the crux of it because he begins to talk about where art comes from. Where the ideas and then the presentation come from. Well, the ideas come from what he calls wit. It doesn't mean what wit means today. It doesn't mean being funny. It means imagination, creative imagination, a spontaneous flow of ideas that all artists have to have from somewhere, either from the muse entering their head and inspiring them, or just from having it from the id, whatever it might be, those primal imaginative moments. Is that enough? No, it's not enough. Because all of us, to a degree, have that, though some less than others. What you need to have, on top of that, is judgment. That is to say, reason, some way to control and channel this imagination, these images, these ideas, and present them. Things like grammar, syntax, meter, skill with a hammer and chisel, skill with paint, and a way to think about controlling these ideas and this imagination. And so he says that wit and judgment often are at strife, that your emotions, that your imagination threatens to run away with you. It's almost like your animal side. And your reason, which of course is the one thing that sets humans apart, is trying to control and craft this imagination into usable works or usable art. In any case, he then uses a really interesting metaphor. He likens reason or judgment to a little jockey on top of a big, powerful horse called wit or imagination. And what that reason or judgment tries to do is rein it in, control it, so they make it around the racetrack rather than the horse going berserk, jumping over the fence.